Hi, Dr. Robin. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to be interviewing you this morning because the timing and your topics just couldn't be more important. So, you work with adolescents and you work with training organizations who work with adolescents, right?
Yes,
What kinds of organizations?
like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, behavioral health clinics where the therapists see adolescents, with
Schools,
schools,
right?
schools,
Schools, yeah.
yes, high school, middle school staff, and counselors, school counselors, chemical dependency clinics that work with adolescents, parent
Great.
groups,
Mhm.
parent support groups. Yeah,
Great. Well,
just
that covers the wide range of
yes.
all of us who interact with adolescents.
Hmm.
And I just thought that, your work and what we're seeing, in our communities right now for teenagers has been really tough. I mean, the pandemic has been really, really rough on
Yes.
kids and particularly on teenagers. And
Yes.
I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Um, what have you thought about as you've noticed how hard teens have been hit through the
Yeah.
pandemic?
My mind always tends to go to the kind of the roots, to the why of it, as a beginning place. And the normal adolescent developmental task is to start leaving the nest, go out into the
Mhm.
world, make connections outside of the family, establish a social network with peers, learn how to be in the larger community with other adults.
Oh
And
gosh, and all this has been disrupted.
yes, the pandemic started and they were all isolated at home. I mean, strangely enough, online connections have been very helpful. This is right. This is something that a lot of parents and adults are very concerned about: is how much time kids are connecting online. But in some ways, that's been a saving grace during the pandemic. The online support they're getting is from peers only. They're not connecting with other adults in the community. So there's a huge gap there. And our adolescents need adults. They need adults. So,
Okay, so what do you think would be helpful to parents that are listening and, who are wondering how to help their own kids right now through this recovery period? What do you
yeah.
think is helpful for parents to do if their kids seem really anxious, really
Yes.
depressed, not wanting to socialize, feeling uncomfortable going to school? I mean,
Yes.
that's what we're hearing a lot of.
Yes.
So,
School opened back up and kids wanted to stay home even though they were miserable. So in my work, I bring four foundational tools. And the first one is validation, the process and practice of validation. And so that is going to be the very first thing that parents are going to want to
and can
do.
you give people a really small example of what validation is for those who
Yes,
aren't really
my
sure?
working definition, and it's simple but not easy. This is something really
That's a
important
great
to remember.
explanation.
It is really simple, but it is so not easy. But my working definition for validation is to give someone, so the parent wants to give their child the experience of the child feeling seen, heard, accepted, valued, and loved for who the child is in that moment as the child is, and they don't have to change anything. So that means the parent has to be able to show up to the child in the child's anxiety, in the child's depression, in their resistance to going to school, the hopelessness, the overwhelm, all of that, and say, you don't have to change any of that. I'm going to be right here with you. Now, the other thing to remember about validation is it's the first step. That's where you begin.
So wait, before we go to the next steps, because we want all four steps, and we're going
Well,
to cover them.
yeah.
But before you go to the next step in validation,
Uh-huh.
Let's go back to that moment of, I hate school, I don't want to go.
Mhm.
Just give a sample of what validating would sound like.
A validating moment with a child who says, I don't want to go to school, might be the parent sits on the side of the bed, puts their arm around their child, and just say, let's just sit here for a minute. That might be a validating moment.
Mhm.
It might be something more directive, like, I can see with your whole being that the thought of going to school is really, really hard for you right now.
Mhm.
That might be a validating, a
Right. But what
validation.
I hear you saying is, you're not saying, okay, stay home, forget it.
Correct.
But
Correct.
what we're doing is we validate the feelings that the kid is having.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear
Yes.
those feelings, but we're not saying, and then you don't go to school ever.
Correct. Correct.
And the other thing that parents make a big mistake with is when the kid says, I don't want to go to school, I hate school, is they say, you're going, get in the car. And there hasn't been that moment, just that moment of validation
Right.
of, I get it. I get how
Yes.
hard this is right now. It is hard.
Yes. Yes.
And we're going to get through this.
Yes.
That little level of reassurance, right? There's
Yes.
kind of validation with a little bit of reassurance.
Yes. Yeah. And again, it's so dependent on the situation with the child. So it may be that the parent can quickly then move towards, okay, so let's figure out how we're going to make this work for you. So now we can get into the problem solving. But it may be that, especially if you have a child, a teenager who's had trauma, or who has been experiencing bullying, or if there's complications, it might take a little bit more validation before you get to the next piece of problem solving, or encouraging, or reassuring. And so this is one of the things that I teach is really to make sure people understand that we can we can confuse sometimes reassuring, encouraging, praising as validation. It is not. Validation is simply saying, I see where you're at right here and right now. And I have the ability
Mm,
to sit with you in this place and
yes.
manage my own feelings that come up, my anxiety, my wanting to solve or fix. I can do this right here with you, because when the parent can do that for the child then begins to say, oh, okay, well, this is manageable. We can figure out a way to do this. But you got to have that moment. And the thing that is also important to remember, and I I learned this the hard way, even though I teach it, is that we cannot decide for the other person if they've been validated. So I was having
This
this
is a
really
very I'm laughing with knowing, this is a very difficult, challenging thing. But if you hang in there with your kid with validation, you also get closer connection. They just feel more connected and more understood.
Yes,
And it doesn't change their feelings, and that's okay, but they're not alone in it.
right,
And it helps them not need to withdraw so much,
correct.
because now somebody really sees them, gets them, and then they usually can move into kind of next steps of
Yes,
how to get through the day. I know I had this
yes.
when one of my kids was teenagers back in the day, and that was a while ago. um, we had two grandparents die sort of back to back, and getting up and going to school just seemed pointless in the
Hmm.
grief,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so I would get up with her in the morning, and we'd have some hot cocoa. And she was saying, I just don't see the point in school. And I said, I can understand that. And she's like, what's the point of life if we're all going to die? And,
Yes.
very deep philosophical adolescent questions that often
Yes.
are so deep, they have no answers.
Yeah.
And, all I could do was sit with her and
Hmm.
say, I know it really does at times seem like life is so pointless. Like, yeah, we are all going to die. And, all I could do was agree, right? But at
Right.
the same time, that's validating.
It
And I
is.
didn't say, and you have to get up and go to school. We just said, let's just go slow this morning. Let's just go
Yes.
slow and have some hot cocoa and just talk about those philosophies of life. And I would just
Mm-hmm.
listen. And then, maybe a half hour later, she was like, all right, I'm ready to go to school.
Yes.
She was done
Yes,
with me.
exactly. Exactly. The other
But
thing,
but that took a while because there was grief,
mhm,
right? She was
mhm,
mourning, and we all were, but that
yeah,
was how it showed up for her. And
yeah,
sometimes with our teens, we don't take the time to just validate their perspective, right? Which is different
exactly.
than ours.
The other thing that I heard you doing in that interaction with your daughter, Sari, was making space for that very, very important thing that adolescents do, which is they do start thinking about the existential questions. That is that is something that happens in adolescence. What is life all about? What's the point? Why does that matter? We're all going to die anyway. What is death?
And the pandemic has really brought that up to a whole new level for
Yes, it
adolescents because
has.
they actually saw the world stop.
Yep.
They saw
Yep.
their schools close. They saw things that, other generations of teenagers didn't experience.
Right. Right. And it will forever affect this generation for sure. So here's one of the second tools that I use in my work. Love and courage is an antidote to fear. And so one of the things I've seen is that often, I think it's very natural, it's very normal. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing, but what we tend to do is we tend to parent from a place of fear. So the parent that says, okay, fine, you don't have to go to school if you're anxious, may be worried and fearful that their child is going to be overwhelmed and can't manage. The
Mhm.
parent that says you just have to just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you're just going to have to soldier on also is parenting from fear. It's like, oh no, my what's going to happen if my child can't be strong and get out there in the world? I call it parenting on the love fear spectrum. So
I love
where
this. So
yes,
many parents struggle with this because, of course, we have these expectations or these ideas of what our kids would be doing. And then when it doesn't happen, people get very afraid, right? Or
yes,
they just
yes.
start, insisting on things.
Yes, yeah. And they're connected, this love and fear. We don't fear without love. I mean, this is why we're afraid for our children, because we love them. But if we can move along the spectrum towards the love end of things, it's so much more strengths based. When we parent from the fear end, it's we basically are parts of us are believing that our children don't have what they need, that they are not capable, that we don't, there's
Mm,
something, or that the world is going to be too much. But the love and the courage end of the spectrum says, so I'm thinking about like the pandemic, and
mm,
what you had just said about this generation. This is life, and life will just clobber us sometimes. And
mhm.
our one of the things that parents can do for their teenagers, their adolescents who are very quickly moving into adulthood, is to prepare them for that rather than doing a lot of protecting. Is how do we prepare? And we can do that by having, first of all, having faith that we have given them the foundation that they need to go out in the world.
Well, I think what you're bringing up is the struggle that many parents are experiencing right now is they haven't felt prepared for this.
Right.
And so they haven't known really how to transmit that preparation to their kids.
Well, and when I say prepare, I am thinking more of kind of psychological preparation
That
rather
hard
than,
things happen,
yeah,
unexpected
yeah,
things happen. We really don't know the future. Life
right,
is unpredictable, but
right.
you have some good steadiness and sturdiness in you to meet these challenges.
Yes,
And
yes,
that life is going to continue to throw challenges, by the way, not maybe as big as this one all the time,
right,
but
exactly.
but you are going to have them,
Yeah.
and you are going to meet them.
And the thing that was so hard about the pandemic and continues to be difficult, but was really hard 2020 into 2021 was that unlike a family or a personal or even a community tragedy or crisis, was that there was nowhere anywhere that wasn't experiencing it. So I think the magnitude of it is what hit all of us so deeply. But at the same time, so for example, your daughters, when they lost both of their grandparents, and you and
Mhm.
your you and your husband, it's like the world can come falling down around us, even if it's standing elsewhere, and it still has that feeling of magnitude. We still, how do we do our lives when everything's falling apart around us? And for children, for adolescents, and this is another quality, an inherent quality of them, I believe, is right, life is drama. And a child who, a teenager, first broken heart, loses the track meet for the entire team, does something embarrassing in the lunchroom. I mean, this is the world falling apart around them.
Right.
Helping our children know that we are human beings having this experience on planet Earth, and our work, this is what I call it, our work is to keep coming back home to ourselves. That's the language I use, which is, we could say this in a multitude of ways. It's about how do we regulate our emotions and calm our nervous system down. That's kind of the physiological level. How do we manage the parts of us that come up, our beliefs, our assumptions, the stories we tell about
Yes, our
what is
expectations about
our
how things were going to
expectation.
look.
Yes. And how do we know and this is the work of preparation through adolescence, childhood and adolescence, is how do we know that in spite of everything that goes on, there is a place within us that is inviolable, that cannot be
Mhm.
violated. Viktor Frankl, who suffered the Holocaust, his
Mhm.
entire family died, and he developed the therapy, logotherapy, which, this idea that there is meaning no matter what. And I think that is found within us, in helping our adolescents tap into that and keep coming back to that. And validation is the place to begin. Because when
Okay.
we see them in these moments,
Right. Well,
they go, oh, that's me.
for everyone listening, this is something everyone can practice, even with your partners, even with anyone else in your life, your friends. I just got an email from someone that felt like she had really overstepped with a friend who was talking about an issue in her life. And she said she felt so bad. She didn't respect her boundaries. But really, it's just a practice of how do you validate without trying to fix? How do you
Yes.
validate? And how do we all do that with each other without overstepping, the meaning that people are making out of their own experience?
Yes. 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 That's
That
such
just ties the whole thing
that's a
together. So that's a
really
good
important thing.
practice for everybody listening. That
Yeah.
is a really helpful thing. And
Yeah.
One of the things that you and I have talked about, Robin, which I would love for our listeners to hear more about, is you've talked about people who work with adolescents and people who have adolescents as parents, unfinished adolescent development in themselves.
Yeah.
First of all, explain to everyone what that is.
Okay. So
And then tell us how that affects things and what we can do about it.
Okay. Let me see if I can say this short. I wrote a 400-page dissertation on this, so I have to.
Yeah, well, you're going to have to summarize.
Oh, summarize. In indigenous cultures and for eons, what has happened is when children reach a certain stage and the elders of the community are watching and they begin asking those existential questions, the elders know that that individual is ready to move into the next place, the next stage. We call it adolescence. What they did was they did a rite of passage, they did a vision quest, they did all of the things that we've read about or seen. And each culture is going to have a different way of doing it. But essentially, what is happening is the adolescent, the child who is yet to become an adult. So this is once that person enters into that thing we call adolescence, that stage we call adolescence, they are not children anymore and they are not adults. And this is so, so important for people to understand. It is unique in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens in this stage, if we were to do it by ritual through initiation, is the person encounters death. It is a encountering their mortality. It also is a death of the ego, if you will, this idea that who they thought they were as children, and it sloughs away. A really good analogy is when the caterpillar enters, this is so cliche, but it's so perfect. The caterpillar enters the cocoon, and when it enters into the cocoon, it dissolves. And that's adolescence. It is a dissolution so that it can come together to be something else. What happens for us in our culture, in many Western cultures, without these rituals, is that we skip over it. We avoid the death, the encounter with death. But when we see adolescents, and of course, there's all the brain stuff around risk taking and impulsivity, but kids who are pulled towards risk taking behavior, drugs, really big, a really big indicator, gang initiations, those kinds of things. Some of the depth psychologists believe and see that these are attempts on the part of the adolescent to initiate themselves. But what's happened is we've had generations of people who've moved through adolescence without the initiatory process, and they move into adulthood, and they've got these adolescent energies, these adolescent parts that have not gotten all the way through to the other side, to what we call adulthood. So when I was doing my dissertation, I actually went through that process. I did not know that's what was happening. But my life was falling apart. We had immense trauma in my family during this period of time. And I was writing about adolescence and trauma and about my own adolescent trauma. And I went through, when I went on a vision quest, I was in my 40s, late 40s, 50s, I can't remember. I was middle-aged when I did this. But when I came out the other side, I was different. I wouldn't be sitting here without having gone. And it was about a 4-year process that we went through. And when I sit with teenagers in my practice, and they're telling me that they've attempted suicide, that they're drinking, that they're using drugs, that they're cutting, that they're having risky online encounters with adult men. I sit with them from what I consider to be a somewhat initiated adult, but I sit with them and I just keep holding this space that says they are going through something. It is not my job to pluck them out of there. My job is to keep showing up and being there with them and saying, how are you keeping yourself safe? What are you learning from this? How do you know where your boundaries are? What are you going to do if you get in trouble? Who are you sharing this information with? Who's going to help you get out the other side? These are the things that I'm doing as I sit with kids. I am not telling them you shouldn't be doing that, because to me, I'm looking at these kids going, this is an initiatory experience, and I am going to sit with you as the wise elder to get you through so you can come out the other side.
There's the rough
And I
stuff.
have worked with kids from, I'll start seeing them when they're like 12, right as they're entering in, and we'll work with them until they're 17, 18, 19 years old. And then a lot of them will keep coming, they'll touch back in and knock on wood. And I've not lost one yet. I mean, they have all come through.
Yeah. So what is an initiated versus an uninitiated adult look like in your view?
I'll speak from my own experience. I'll just say what it was like before and what it is now. So before I went through my process, I had a lot of fear. I wanted to do a lot of controlling with my kids. There was this trauma happening, and it was like, no, we can't have this. Let's fix it. And I'm going around, I'm emailing and I'm managing and I'm doing all.
And fixing,
fix, violating people's boundaries all over the place, not treating other adults like adults, not validating, none of that is validating, enormous anxiety, a lot of somatic issues going in me.
Right. A lot of symptoms from the stress.
Right. Dissociating a little bit, really not paying attention, workaholic.
Exhausting yourself.
Oh, a terrible exhaustion.
Okay. And then coming through it.
Now, I still struggle with those things, but I am able to take care of myself so much differently now. I'm watching this and going, wait a second, we don't need to do that. I move back along the love end of the spectrum. There's this feeling of,
you're not trying to control everything.
I'm not trying to control everything, and I trust the process.
And you're not trying to fix everything.
I'm not trying to fix everything.
Or anything.
Or anything. I listen far better. I take responsibility for what I bring that causes issues. That was something I was very defensive. So now when especially my adult children come to me and say, look, what we're doing here, this is not okay. Instead of being defensive, I will sit and listen. And I am much more courageous about having difficult conversations, confronting with a great deal of respect, compassion, and curiosity about what's going on right now between us. I wasn't able to do that before. There was either confrontation with a lot of conflict, or it was avoidant.
And oftentimes, my experience of that is that we get hung up around our expectations of how we want things to look. I've had to work on this myself too. We have this idea of what our families look like, how things come together. And this process that you're talking about is one where we come through do our own work and come to realize that it's not our job to control, fix, make everything look a certain way, create expectations, and that we check ourselves on those things and say, oh, that's just an expectation. That's not actually reality. Now we have to come into where we are in reality, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And to remember that the work is ongoing. Like I have to keep coming back home to myself again and again and again.
and finding comfort there.
Finding comfort there and a lot of compassion for myself, for the journey, because the self-criticism can undermine. So part of the validation work is also self-validation, which makes room for the self-compassion. So
Wonderful work. Oh my goodness. So
thank you.
that to me was such an important thing. So when you work with like organizations that have staff that work with teens, it sounds like an important part of what you also help them understand is if they have been uninitiated themselves and haven't yet completed some of their own adolescent, how that shows up in them.
Yeah. Yes.
And then how that will affect their work with kids.
Yes. So here's a really good example. I work with a lot of 20-some-year-olds. A lot of the kids that I work with come out of their therapy still uninitiated. I don't feel like that is my job. Is their therapist. My job isn't to be, so there's a lot of work still to be done. But what will happen is 20-some-year-olds will come out of adolescence and they have immediately forgotten what their adolescent experience was like. And there is enormous judgment for themselves as adolescents and for other adolescents. They have no patience. And that usually will continue. Helping people understand that if they are judgmental, self-judgmental, self-critical of their own adolescent experience, who they were when they were kids, when they were teenagers, that is going to show up it's going to get projected onto, very unconsciously, onto the adolescents they're working with. As an uninitiated adult, when I was teaching and I was working with at-risk kids, I still had this adolescent in me who had trauma, had not been taken care of, had not been healed, had not been brought into adulthood. And I did not do damage to my students, but I was always trying to save them. And I was always trying to protect them. And when I began to figure that out is when I said, I have to step out. I have to not do this anymore because I'm not doing them any favors. And the next teacher that came in did what I couldn't do, which was get them ready to go out into the world. I kept wanting to hold them, to care for them, to nurture them. But that was my stuff. And I didn't know that. I did not know that. So one of the other tools, one of the four tools is compassionate curiosity. So validation, love and fear is antidote to courage. Compassionate curiosity is the third one. And that is, let's start getting curious about what's going on. Something's not working in this. Let's say there's a classroom.
Right.
And something's not working. And the kids are unhappy. There's a lot of disrespect. There's a lot of acting out. So let's just get curious. What's going on? And it may be that the teacher is stuck somewhere in their own, whatever's going on for them. And let's say that there's an inner adolescent that they have a lot of judgment against. We can just begin to be compassionately curious about that. This is not about judging. It's not about judging that teacher or the kids. It's just, let's just get curious and assess. And let's look at the dynamics. Let's look at the conversations. What's the discipline like in here? Is there room for the teenagers to have a voice, or do their voices get shut down? Can the adult in the room tolerate rebellion? Can the adult tolerate being challenged? So important for teenagers to be able to do
Right.
that.
Right. So many
And
people get caught up with teenagers around the disrespectful tone,
yes,
right? And they
and
react to the tone,
right.
rather than trying to understand, like, okay, what's underneath this? What am I missing?
Yeah. Yeah.
What am I not getting here?
Yeah.
Help me
And
get
so
it.
that's a good just to wrap this piece up, the fourth tool, equally as important as all of them, but really another foundational one, is helping adults understand the essential nature of adolescence. There's this caterpillar experience going, or cocoon experience going on. And
Oh,
so if
I
it,
just want everybody to study with you.
I would love that. I would love
Feel
that.
like I feel like you are so full of depth and wisdom on so many things, but particularly this stage of life, and how all of us can use some of the things that emerge that are helpful for this particular stage at any stage in our lives,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because all of the skills that you've talked about, compassion and curiosity, and being able to move from fear to the love end of the spectrum, and validation. You can use these in all your relationships.
Yes.
Wait, what
Yes,
was
you
the
can.
fourth one? What was the
The understanding the essential nature of adolescence, and that
understanding?
includes the adolescence that lives within us. I mean,
Right,
even
understanding that.
yes, even if
That
we
those
have an
urges.
initiated adolescent, I'm still aware of a lot of adolescent energy in me, that wants to eat pasta all day long, or,
Yes.
play
And
my video
playful. There's a
games.
playfulness
There's a
too, right?
playfulness,
There is.
yes. And the
Oh, I
rebel,
just
the
I
rebel.
just love this. I know that when I worked in middle school kids, and when I worked with Cocoon House and all the teenagers there, I mean, what I loved about it is my own adolescent sense of play got a
Yes.
place to be with others. And I've always said, people that work in middle schools have to have a middle schooler very alive in them in order to really successfully connect with kids.
Yes, indeed.
And if that part of you just is not alive in you, then you can't make that kind of a connection.
It's very difficult. And yes, and I love, I just love adolescents. I love being
It's
around them.
obvious. Well, the time with you today has been such a gift for everyone listening.
Thank you,
And
Sarri, so much.
thank you so much for sharing. And I know that there's like tons more that we could all learn from you. And I know that you teach, and people can hire you to do workshops and
Mhm,
trainings.
mhm.
And is there any other things that people can sign up for on your website, or anything you want to
Yeah,
tell people
so
about?
there are links on the website to the Teachable website that has classes. Right now, there's just a small handful. There's two free webinars on validation and self-validation,
Great.
and the process of that. And then there is a paid course, about 6 hours, on coming into relationship with the inner critic as an act of self-validation. And
Ah,
there's all kinds of
fabulous.
handouts and resources associated with those. And there's free content on the website as well that they can download. And
Great. What a gift of resource, and right at the right time, because I do, hear from so many people how concerned they are about their teenagers, about their young adults through this time. And I think that we all just need to tool up a bit more so that we feel more capable of offering something valuable and validating to
yes,
the younger people in our lives. So
Yeah.
thank you so
Yeah.
much,
You're
Dr.
welcome, Sarri.
Robin.
Thank
It's
you. Thank you. Thank you.
great to be with you.
It was wonderful
Okay.
to talk with you. Thanks.